Welcome to the show, everybody. We just want to take a minute. Today is July 5th. Tim and I recorded this episode about a week or so ago, but today on July 5th, we have just learned about the passing of Richard Donner. And since we are talking Superman 2 and we are talking the Donner cut, I thought it was fitting to add in a few moments of Tim and I kind of reflecting on who honestly is a director and producer who was very vital to us growing up. And, you know, even though not so much in comic book movies for my show, a lot of 80s movies that Tim can talk about. So we just wanted to take a moment and talk about the career of Richard Donner. I'll just let you go first, Tim. What's kind of a memory of how you came about knowing who Richard Donner was?
Okay, well, I think I didn't really... I think Richard Donner became Richard Donner to me, like knowing him as a director was really Lethal Weapon. Yeah. And then going back, I mean, of course I saw Goonies. That's probably the first Donner movie that I saw as a kid, but I didn't associate him with that as much as I associated Steven Spielberg as being the director of that. So
honestly thought Spielberg directed it for years.
I think Sean Astin had some comments about Donner would tell him, okay, I want you to play this scene this way, and then he'd walk away and Spielberg would come and say, no, do it this way. So you kind of say they were co-directors of that movie, but I think Lethal Weapon was probably the first movie where I remember the name Richard Donner, and of course you had the sequels as well after that, which is kind of what kind of more cemented his name in my mind. But other movies of his that I've come to know that he was a part of was Scrooged, is still one of my favorite Christmas movies. One we haven't covered yet on my podcast, but one that I'm looking forward to doing. But I think Goonies, Lethal Weapon, Scrooge are definitely at the top of the list for me that I remember. And then we talked before we started recording. I didn't realize he had directed The Toy with Richard Pryor, which I watched a lot as a kid. And then Lady Hawk is a movie that I have not seen, but I know people talk about it a lot from 1985. So I'm definitely going to have to watch that one. But that for as far as the 80s, those are the ones that really stood out to me was Goonies, Lethal Weapon, finding out later about The Toy, and Scrooged are the main ones for me.
Of course, for me, as many people are going to know, it's Superman.
Mm-hmm, of course.
You know, him being the director of Superman, which I think was his second movie right after The Omen. I'm not 100% on that. Of course, I am a fan of The Omen. Yeah. I wasn't aware it was a Richard Donner film, even when I saw it obviously years later. I wasn't even born when The Omen came out.
Yeah, but, the Omen was 76 and Superman was 78. So yeah, that was his second feature film after doing so much work in TV during the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, which we'll get into that. I want to get into that too because but just imagine that your second movie is Superman.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And that just shows how great of a director he was. But going back to the television thing, I don't know an awful lot. I know he directed an episode or two of Get Smart, which I was a huge fan of, watching on Nick at Night growing up. And I know he directed a lot of other things, but the most famous, I'll just flat out say famous thing that I know of is that he is the director of Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, the famous Twilight Zone episode with William Shatner. There's something on the wing. Yeah, when I found out that was Richard Donner, I was just like, this man is one of my favorite directors. You know, on top of the ones you mentioned, Goonies, Scrooged, and Lethal Weapon movies. I mean, it's great.
Yeah. So here's some TV shows that he actually worked on in his career. Some of you may not know, they're way before your time, but for me, there's shows that either I watched on reruns as a kid or ones that I know my parents watched. The Man from U.N.C.L.E., he directed 4 episodes of that. He directed 3 episodes of Gilligan's Island, 3 episodes of Perry Mason. He also did episodes of Get Smart, The Fugitive, Wild Wild West, which my sister was obsessed with and I enjoyed watching as a kid. Ironside, which I know most people don't even know what that show was. The Streets of San Francisco, and Kojak.
He liked his detective shows.
Yeah, well, those were pretty big in that era as well. Yeah. So,
yeah, unfortunately for superhero fans, you know, he really only did Superman. You know, you'll hear Tim and I talk about in the Superman 2 episode about him being removed from Superman 2.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the Donner cut that we will discuss on Moving Panels. Then he had nothing to do with 3 or 4. And it probably goes to show how he had nothing to do with 3 and 4. Unfortunately, he wouldn't return back until the X-Men movies. He actually produced the first X-Men movie, Bryan Singer's directed X-Men movie.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I don't know why, he produced X-Men Origins Wolverine.
Because they expected it to make a lot of money. That's why. As a producer,
yeah.
it's about the dollars and cents on that one, I think.
I don't know what was, but he, I don't know. He hasn't directed a lot, which sometimes I think that's good for a director. Like, so I think that's what helps, is that if you've got a director that, in terms of directing, who really looks at the work and decides, I am going to direct this because I think it's going to be good. I mean, I even enjoy we were talking right before we recorded, the last movie he directed was 16 Blocks with Bruce Willis and Mos Def. And I'm a huge Bruce Willis fan, and I actually really enjoyed that movie. I think it's kind of an underrated action thriller.
Yeah, 16 Blocks is fantastic. We was talking about, I just watched that a couple weeks ago. Hadn't seen it in a long time, and still holds up really well. So if you haven't seen it, go watch it.
So again, we're not going to take up too much time with this, but since we were doing an episode that had a connection to Richard Donner, but it was recorded before his passing, we did want to acknowledge his passing and just the respect that we had for him as a filmmaker. And so again, today, July 5th, 2021, Richard Donner did pass away at the age of 91. And on behalf of Tim and the 80's Flick Flashback and me with the Moving Panels podcast, we just wanted to show our respect. So thank you, Richard Donner, for all you did. One movie, 2 dicks, 3 villains, a 4 decades old hero, and a ton of inconsistencies. On this special crossover episode of Moving Panels, we discuss Superman 2, The Donner Cut. Welcome to Moving Panels, the podcast where we discuss movies and TV shows based on, inspired by, and adapted from the world of comic books. I'm your host, Laramy Wells, and this is actually a continuation, a part 2, if you will, from another podcast, the 80's Flick Flashback, where we talked about Superman 2 already. This is going to be the Donner Cut, and joining me today is the host and creator of that podcast, Mr. Tim Williams. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing good, Laramy. Let's get started with this one.
Yeah, so again, this is primarily going to be the Donner Cut. Well, there obviously will be some overlap with the theatrical to do comparisons and whatnot. But if you want to hear me and Tim review the original theatrical movie, head on over to Apple or wherever you listen to your podcast. Look up the 80's Flick Flashback. We did the episode a couple of weeks ago. I would have liked for them to fall about the same time, but I had to be a little personal here. This is my 25th episode. This is the 25th movie we have talked about on this podcast, and I wanted to make it the 25th instead of the 24th, which probably would have been closer to when Tim released his version, or his side, part 1. But I wanted to make this 25th. It's a big deal. And just like anything with comic books, when it's a big deal, it's a big deal. This is a crisis. This is a crossover event.
Yes.
This is wonderful. All right. So we are going to get into a little bit of the background. Tim and I also went over this, obviously, with theatrical, because whether you're talking theatrical or Donner Cut, a lot of the setup and preparation for the movie all falls the same. And, of course, we'll get into the issues with the director that led to this Donner Cut. So back in 1977, Richard Donner and the Salkin brothers got together, and they were going to film Superman. And in this grand idea, they were going to film 2 movies at once. Not back to back, but actually at the same time. You know, if they were using a particular set, they were going to film all of the scenes from Superman 1 and Superman 2 at that time. If they only had an actor for a certain day, they were going to film all of their scenes from Superman 1 and from Superman 2 at that time. So A lot of filming going on. As an actor, I would think that could get very confusing.
Oh yeah.
Having to realize where, especially your characterization, to realize
Mm-hmm.
where you are in the story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've heard stories from more recent movies that have done this. We talked about that, like Back to the Future 2 and 3, Matrix 2 and 3, The Lord of the Rings. I think it was probably watching behind the scenes stuff for Lord of the Rings. Is the one that I probably know the most about. But them talking about remembering where in the story they were for the different scenes they were filming. And I guess even somewhat Infinity War and Endgame, even most recently, was probably a lot of that. And because they filmed so many different variations of story as the story line, some of the storylines were changing while they were filming, it can be very confusing.
And we'll definitely get into variations of scenes.
Yeah.
In this, talking about the Donner cut. But long story short, the producers, the Salkins, however you want to pronounce it,
right?
They felt that Richard Donner had gone way over budget.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Superman was the most expensive movie in history. It was roughly like $50 million to make, which was just unheard of for a movie at that time. Right. Now we just kind of go, oh, that's an independent film, isn't it?
Right.
But at the time, most expensive movie in history, and he hasn't even finished 2 yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were getting a little upset with him. Donner claims he was never given a budget, which I could definitely see from what I know about the Salkind brothers. So they went and brought in Richard Lester. So let's get this clear. There's a Richard Donner. Mm-hmm. There's a Richard Lester. I will probably make this clear by just calling them Lester and Donner throughout the episode. But they brought him in as a second unit director. So pretty much he's like a backup. They made it believe for Donner that Lester was going to film some stuff while he was filming some stuff so they could get the movie done faster and quicker. Salkinds had worked with Lester on the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers, which I believe that one they did where they recorded them really close.
Yeah, I think so. I think that was another reason why they wanted him on the project as well.
Yeah, they had filmed those kind of in the same style. And so again, they suggested that Donner just focus on finishing Superman 1 while Lester would continue to work on what he could on Superman 2. And at the time, and we get into more detail on this on the 80's Flick Flashback, so go back and listen to that one. Donner had completed somewhere between 50, 60, 70%, and we get into why we don't know the exact number on the 80's Flick Flashback. But when the movie was finished, only about 30 to 40% of it is actually Donner's film. Because in order for Lester to be credited as the director, he had to direct roughly like 70% of the movie. Mm-hmm. Which explains why more recently with Justice League, why even the 2016 version of Justice League still says it's directed by Zack Snyder, even though Joss Whedon pretty much finished the movie.
Right.
The majority of the movie is still Zack Snyder's, even though it was cut down to a measly 2 hours and didn't tell a story well. But we've done that before on this show. So go back and listen to our Justice League and our Justice League Snyder Cut episodes from earlier.
Mm-hmm. Lots of fun on those.
Yeah. But eventually, Donner was let go, and Lester took over as the official director 2 years later in 1979. So we got our theatrical version. Again, you want to hear about the theatrical version, check out the 80's Flick Flashback. We are now going to get into the Donner Cut.
Dun, dun, dun.
So in 2004, Margot Kidder was doing an interview. She kind of kicked off this whole thing. Now, keep in mind, this was before social media was really the thing it is now.
Oh, yeah.
Even early 2000s, that was still true. So, social media wasn't until like 2008, maybe 2006. I think in 2006 was when Twitter launched.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. And so this was, again, blowing things up on the internet. Mm-hmm. Margot Kidder said in an interview, there's a whole other Superman 2 in a vault somewhere with scenes of Christopher Reeve, and me that have never seen the light of day. It's far better than the one that was released. And first thing you go is, wow, that's a statement to make.
Yeah.
But she makes that statement, fans hear that statement, and it becomes, obviously, again, social media wasn't much of a thing, but there was a website. Funny enough, it was actually a Planet of the Apes website.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that started the kind of movement. They wanted people to write. Like, yes, back in the day, people actually wrote letters
Right.
and mailed them
With a stamp.
And yeah. And so they wanted people to write letters saying, we want to see this Donner cut. We want to see the Donner cut. Just like social media several years ago was, release the Snyder cut, release the Snyder cut.
Mm-hmm.
And, the parallel between the two, because it was finding out that there was a version that Snyder intended. This wasn't just something out of the blue where people were all of a sudden saying, I want to see this. They actually knew that it existed.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously we're talking the early 2000s. We are 30 years almost since the movie had started filming.
Yes.
We had, sadly, Christopher Reeve was no longer with us. Jackie Cooper was no longer with us. Margot Kidder wouldn't be long until she would pass.
Right.
But even if they were still alive, they're 30 years older. You can't shoot new footage like Snyder was able to do with Justice League. And so it would really just be editing incomplete footage, test footage, anything that they could find. And so enter a guy by the name of Michael Thal. Michael Thal, who was the editor, he also was a very close friend of Donner. He actually assisted him, 80's Flick Flashback, he assisted him on the movie Goonies.
Right.
He got producer credit on both Lethal Weapon 1 and Lethal Weapon 2. And so he and Richard Donner were really close, but Donner didn't want anything to do with this. So it all started with Michael Thal. And in 2001, so just a few years earlier, they had remastered the original Superman, for a special edition release. And in the process, Michael Thal came across what he said were 6 pallets worth of footage shot by Donner. I don't know how many canisters that would be, but 6 pallets worth. I'm assuming they're not, one can tall. There's a few cans there, so you're talking a lot. And again, of course, like I said, this includes screen tests. Things that were not meant to be in a film,
right?
But because of this situation, they found a way to put them into the film. And we'll get into that a little bit more. The other thing they used were TV edits, which we talk a little bit about in the 80's Flick Flashback, because some of the TV edits, especially some of the overseas TV edits, included scenes that were not in the theatrical cut or alternate takes on scenes that were not in the theatrical cut. And so altogether, TV edits with this found footage, with the Lester version of the movie, we get this Donner cut, which Richard Donner eventually did come on board and help establish, gave his notes, gave his thought, this is what I had originally planned and all that. And in November 28th of 2006, it wasn't a theatrical release. It was released to DVD. We got the Donner cut. So like you do sometimes, not sometimes, you do it all the time. Like you do, Tim, I'm going to ask you, when was the first time you heard of or even saw the Donner cut?
I heard about it, which we kind of briefly discussed on the episode, when Superman Returns was coming out in 2006, I believe, was the first I heard of it. And I think I only heard of it because there was a big display of it at a Walmart with like the DVD copies. And I was like, the Donner cut, what is that? And probably there was some news article. I was a big subscriber to Entertainment Weekly or Entertainment, magazines. So I'm sure there was some.
Doesn't everyone have a subscription to Entertainment Weekly, but they don't know how or why?
How they got it?
Yeah, right. They just get it Entertainment Weekly in the mail.
Yeah. So that was when I first heard about it. And I remember thinking, I kind of want to see that because if I remember correctly, Superman Returns was supposed to be like a direct sequel to Superman 2?
Superman 2, yeah.
Yeah.
They acted as if 3 and 4 never happened.
Exactly, yeah.
Which a lot of us think that about those two.
Yeah.
But yeah, and again, it is, and we'll get into this when I don't know how much we'll get into this aspect of it, but they were basing it off of the theatrical cut.
Right, not
the Donner cut, yeah.
Right. So anyway, so I knew they were somewhat connected, but I didn't see it then because I want to say like at that point, video stores were kind of going out. Redbox was kind of making its kind of surge.
Yeah,
and
this was
so
in that transition.
Yeah, and I don't remember if this one was even one that was even rentable. It was just you had to buy it to see it, I think.
I couldn't tell you. I bought it. I think I bought it the day it came out.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. So it's something that, I heard about then and really kind of forgot about. And so when we were doing Superman, your very first episode of Moving Panels, I think we talked about doing this episode, and you mentioned the Donner cut, and I was like, yeah, I think I remember seeing something about that. And so it became available to purchase a digital version a couple of months ago, and I scooped it up for a good bargain price, knowing that I don't usually buy movies I've never seen before. But I was like, I knew we were going to talk about it, so as well, instead of trying to find it to rent for $4.99 or $2.99, I can spend $5 and just have it. And so I purchased it and watched it.
And I got to tell you, I don't know if I actually bought it the day it came out, but I know it was very soon, like you're saying, when it was displayed, because the original DVD cover art for it was so eye-catching, because it's a black box.
Yeah.
But then it's just got the Superman chest of Clark pulling open his shirt and showing the S. And that's it. That's the cover. And it just says Superman 2, the Donner cut.
Yeah.
And so it very much catches your eye, especially if you're a Superman fan like me.
Yeah.
So I know I bought it. I think I bought it, talking about things going, that being the transition. I'm pretty sure I bought mine at Circuit City.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So there you go. There's a dated reference there.
Yeah.
But as Tim just mentioned, we have talked about the first movie. That was the very first episode of Moving Panels. So go back and give that to a listen. Give that one a listen as well. But please forgive us. Again, it was my first episode. Sound quality may not be great. Our flow may not be great. Again, we're 25 episodes in. Hopefully it's getting better.
Yeah.
And if you do think it's getting better, rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts. We'd appreciate it. So I'm not going to talk too much about the characters. Superman's also one that we've talked about several other times before with Justice League and Batman v Superman. I've done episodes before. So Superman, once again, Clark Kent, the late great, wonderful icon, legend, Christopher Reeve. He returns to the role because they're filming at the same time, so he was already doing it. He is the single greatest person to ever wear a superhero costume, in my opinion. He brings the character to life so well. He's just so good, and I'll leave it at that unless you've got something more you want to say.
No, I agree with that. I mean, he's the Superman that that was the first iteration of Superman that I remember seeing. So yeah, that works for me.
I will throw in a little trivia about this. So when they went back to filming, because they got Superman 1 out, and then they went back to film for Superman 2. So when they resumed filming in July of 1979, Christopher Reeve actually had a problem because he had already committed to the movie Somewhere in Time, which is another one that I'm sure Tim will cover on his 80's Flick Flashback at some point.
At some point, yep.
And so Christopher Reeve was, because the Salkinds are horrible people, and I'm going on record saying that, they sued Christopher Reeve for breach of contract. I really would like to know what that contract was, because they started filming this movie 2 years earlier. Like, what are you committed to? How good is this contract? But they worked it out. So, and then Christopher Reeve, I do know that when he came back, he did put in his new contract with them a stipulation where he got a little bit more creative control of his character.
Right.
Which, again, this man is Superman. So yes, I'll give you creative control. Just don't direct another Superman movie. But that's for another episode on another day.
Right.
We also get Lois Lane, Margot Kidder, another late and great. Now, my thing about the character of Lois, since we're going to talk about this is all about the Donner cut. Donner's version, because there is a difference in the theatrical version of Lois Lane and the Donner version of Lois Lane. Donner's version of Lois, she's smarter. She's more of like an actual investigative reporter. However, the Donner cut doesn't give her kind of the arc that the theatrical, I think, did.
Yeah.
The theatrical did have more of an arc for Lois, because the theatrical version showed more that she's flawed. I mean, you talked about her being a chain smoker and that causing some issues, but she's a chain smoker who cares about her health because she wants her orange juice freshly squeezed. But Lois in the Donner cut, she plays a more active role.
Yeah.
You know, she's actually figuring out that Clark is Superman.
Much faster.
Yes, but it's actually her figuring it out versus the theatrical release where it's by accident. You know, she has her suspicion.
Right.
But true. Then it's Clark tripping and his hand going straight into the fire that makes her go, "You are Superman. You have to be Superman. You can't hide it from me anymore."
Right. Because the biggest, and I don't know if you're kind of going this way, but the biggest one of the biggest differences in the two versions is her quote unquote sacrifice to prove that he is Superman. In the Donner cut, she accuses him, very quickly after making the sketch. Which I thought that scene was fantastic of her, finding the picture and doing a little sketch. But then she jumps out of a window, and of course Clark or Superman runs down and does all these things unbeknownst to bystanders to kind of brace her fall. And then she's like, well, maybe he isn't. In the Lester version, it's the Niagara Falls scene where she jumps over and goes down the river, and totally the same idea, just two different scenarios. But in the Lester cut, when they're back at the hotel, she's doubting that. Like she really thinks, well, I got this one wrong. I don't think she has that same feeling in the Donner cut. I think
in the Donner cut, she's still determined,
right,
to prove it.
Well, she proves it by pulling a gun on him. So that's you're pretty well committed at that point. So
I think the Donner cut does make her more of who Lois is. She's an investigative reporter. She's always trying to figure things out. I mean, she says it right at the beginning, like how I'm, the greatest reporter ever.
Right.
How did I not see all of this?
Yeah.
Which
she says she says the same line in Lester's version, but a different way, in a different situation, a different time. So yeah.
Both movies do her well, but in two completely different ways. And we're going to be doing a lot of that in this episode. And I'll talk more about that when we kind of come to the end about my thoughts about both versions. Gene Hackman, of course, returns as Lex Luthor. To me, he's a throwaway character, a side character. I do like him more towards the end. At the beginning, you're kind of like, okay, why is Lex in the movie? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And of course, Gene Hackman gets top billing because he has some amazing contract that puts him over Superman, puts him over the main villain. The main villain even gets last billing. And we talk a lot about that on the 80's Flick Flashback. So again, give that a listen. I will say though, I did enjoy Gene Hackman's humor.
Yes. Yeah.
Because he does it so easily. Like it's not forced. It's cheesy, but not too cheesy.
It's not over the top. It's not overdone.
And it's humor done by a really arrogant person.
Yeah. Yeah.
When the Battle of Metropolis is happening and he's just like laying on top of some file cabinets in the Daily Planet. And there's a scene where Jimmy Olsen walks by with a coffee and he just takes the coffee from Jimmy Olsen. Those moments are great. Just the little fluttering the white handkerchief as he's walking into the Oval Office.
Oh, yeah.
There's some great moments. When he's talking back to Jor-El. Again, this is the Donner cut, so there is Jor-El.
Yeah.
When he's talking back to Jor-El, it's just that arrogance that comes across as humor, and he does a good job of that. I like his portrayal of Lex Luthor and keeping that levity in the movie.
Yeah.
All right, but let's get into our newer characters. Yes, they were in the original, but when we covered the first Superman, we did not talk about the three villains that are in this movie. So we're going to break those down, at least get their comic connection. So General Zod, our main villain, debuted in Adventure Comics number 283 back in April of 1961, 20 years before the movie released. Funny enough, it is actually a Superboy story. And it's where Superboy finds a lot of gadgets and gizmos that his father Jor-El created. And one of those is the Phantom Zone projector. Okay. Because in the comics, it's more of like a projector that transports you to the Phantom Zone. And in that comic, we find out what the Phantom Zone is and how the Kryptonians used it to punish criminals. And we are introduced to General Zod, who is on trial for trying to have this uprising where he had an army of duplicates. He duplicated himself. Funny little thing here, if you look really close at his duplicates all look like Bizarro. They all have kind of that rock glass looking edging face. In this movie, he is brilliantly played by Terrence Stamp. In fact, his portrayal of Zod was so good that they actually altered Zod in the comics to look more like Terrence Stamp.
Oh, wow.
Because when Zod is first introduced, he's clean shaven. A lot of times he was bald, which of course would have confused a lot of people with Lex Luthor. But Stamp's performance had them change it to where Zod, even to this day, usually has dark hair and a goatee. And that's all thanks to Terrence Stamp. What were your thoughts of Terrence Stamp's portrayal of our main villain Zod, our first super villain, Superman?
I mean, it's Terrence Stamp. It's iconic. I mean, he's an iconic actor with an iconic presence, iconic accent, or, manner of speaking. So, yeah, I mean, I think it worked great. And what's interesting about even thinking about this time period, he's not a very menacing presence in the sense of stature. I mean, he's not a big guy. Of course, that's why you've got Nan as kind of like the heavy. But yeah, I like Terrence Stamp a lot. When I think of General Zod, that's who I think of. I mean, it was weird. I know we're kind of jumping movies, but even Man of Steel, it was hard for me to see Zod as that character. I was like, I want him to be a little bit more, a little bit more
cunning, calculating.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, he's a general, but he can get things done without necessarily getting his hands dirty. That's really kind of how Terrence Stamp, because Terrence Stamp, you think about, he always stood with like his hands behind his back.
Yeah.
It's very, but yet he had a presence, and it was so well done.
It's like arrogance and wits. It's like he wants to outsmart you, or at least make you think that he's outsmarted you. You know what I'm saying? It's like he carries that I know more than you arrogant feel.
Well,
more than I'm gonna beat you with my brute strength or my powers.
Yeah.
The powers to me were were very secondary to his I'm gonna beat you with my mind type of personality.
Yeah, because he really only used his powers when he was like, this is the level we have reached. I now have to use these powers.
Right.
Because other than that, he really kind of intimidates people just by what he's saying. He pretty much shows an example of his power and then goes, all right, now kneel before Zod. Now, another Terrence Stamp little reference here. Are you aware that he returned to the Superman franchise later as a different character?
No, I did not.
Yes, so Terrence Stamp in the 2000s would actually be the voice of Jor-El on the television show Smallville.
Well, you know what? When you say that, I vaguely remember that because I watched the first several seasons of Smallville. So that kind of blew off some cobwebs in my mind.
Yeah. He never played Zor-El.
Right, he just did the voice.
Yeah, in fact, when when Jor-El eventually actually appears in person on the show, he was played by Julian Sands. But every time Clark would go to the cave and he would listen to Jor-El speak, it was the voice of Terrence Stamp. So
cool.
Next up is our first big bad female supervillain, I should say, is Ursa, played by Sarah Douglas. Very, I think, underrated performance.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Now, this character was created for the movie. She did not exist in the comic books. Some people think she was inspired by other characters, but the actual character of Ursa did not exist. However, DC brought her into the universe in Action Comics number 845 in January of 2007. So it took 30 years for the character to even pop up in the comics, but Ursa is now a character in the comics. I really liked, and the Donner cut does a better job of showing this than I think the Lester cut does. But what did you think of her collecting badges?
Yeah, that was kind of a weird tick of hers, I guess. So yeah, I did like the line about, oh, I see on this planet the men wear the jewelry, and she rips off
And
the
ribbons,
generals,
yeah.
your ribbons, whatever. So yeah, it's just one of those quirky. I mean, they're quirky anyway. So I didn't think too much about it, but it was kind of weird.
I like it because it's a very villainous thing, you know, kind of having that trophy. You know, she rips the one off the astronaut, which is just a horrible death. Horrible death. And she's got that one on. Then she gets the one from the sheriff's deputy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, she gets the one from the general, but that's removed from the theatrical cut.
Oh, okay.
But yet you see it on her in the
Later
Battle of
on.
Metropolis.
Yeah.
And I even think she gets another one. I think there's another one you see on her, but you never see how she gets it.
Mm-hmm.
But I liked it. Like, she's just, you know, she's turning into a NASCAR driver with all these patches all over.
Right.
But that character, more so in the Donner cut, I think, just extremely vicious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just do not mess with her, especially if you're a male.
Right.
But what I also liked was in the Donner cut, she's put on the same level with Zod.
Right.
She doesn't feel like a lackey.
Mm-hmm.
And she definitely, as the theatrical version made it look, you know, she's not in love with Zod. She's not the love interest for Zod. Like, there's no sense of anything other than they are side by side wanting to conquer.
More like partners than like, just, you know, you're in the spot because you're my girlfriend kind of a trope.
And then, of course, we got our big muscle guy, silent guy, Non, played by Jack O'Halloran. This was also created for the movie. He did not appear in the comics until the exact same comic Ursa appeared in 2007, Action Comics number 845. I don't know how I feel about the character of Non, because the theatrical cut and the Donner cut, they don't really change a lot, except the Donner cut doesn't have him whimpering as much. Like, there's a lot of scenes where, like, you talk about in the 80's Flick Flashback episode when they arrive on Earth and then they see the snake, and they have where he's trying to use his heat vision, and then they end up in the town and he's practicing on the truck.
Right.
And he's just getting all frustrated that it's not working. And then when it does work, he gets all happy like a giddy little baby, you know, discovering he can do something.
Yeah. And thinking about that, like even kind of watching it again, they almost make, and this is weird to say, they almost make him inhuman. I know they're not human, but in the sense of, like, as a kid, I looked at him as more of like this is bad to say, but like a dog, like a pet. Yeah. Like he's their pet. He's not a human like them. He's just a beast or an animal. So like, that I didn't think of him in the baby sense, but I thought of him more like, maybe because of the grunts and stuff, and maybe think of him more as he's just their attack dog, and he's not smart like them, so he just does those weird things. So
no, that's a good representation of it too. Kind of looking at him as like Zod's pet. But yeah, it kind of just seems, I don't know how I feel about the character. I really don't, because even what you're saying, I remember in the Battle of Metropolis scene, there's this quick shot of he and then Ursa flying up towards Superman, and he's got this like almost like he's trying to be a monster. Like he's got this look on his face, like "Arr!" And he's got his hands in the kind of claw shape as he's flying up. And then they show Ursa, and Ursa's just stone faced, you know, hand straight.
Right.
You know, I didn't get it. But those were at least our three new ones to talk about for this episode, because we did not feature them in the original Superman episode. All right, for the moving panels portion, we're obviously not going to be able to talk about comic book connections because this was an original story. It doesn't tie into a comic book. And so all of our comic book connections come from just the characters, which I mentioned are three villains and their comic book connections. And if you go back to episode number 1 of Moving Panels, you'll get the others and their comic connections. So we're just really going to talk about the Donner cut itself. We're going to get into some of the differences, as well as the way some of the things kind of laid out. And we'll just start with the opening. So just like in the theatrical cut, it does open with a recap of what we saw in the first Superman movie. They redo the scene that was the very first scene of the original Superman movie, except this time we get Marlon Brando back, and I'll talk a little bit more about the return of Brando for the Donner Cut. Some of the lines, though, were actually different. A few of the lines were changed.
Mm-hmm.
And we do not at all get the Paris terrorist scene, which was an all Richard Lester scene. That's completely taken out, which I had no problem with.
Yeah, I enjoyed that scene. I thought it was a good scene.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a good scene. It's got a little funny moment when Superman rescues Lois on the elevator and then says, "I believe this is your floor." Mm-hmm. I do have my problems with the fact that everyone in Paris appears to talk English except that one cop.
Right.
They can all speak English except the one cop. I'll also point out, because we didn't talk about that scene on your episode, one of the terrorists is actually Uncle Vernon from Harry Potter.
Oh, okay.
So we get just the sentencing of Zod and Ursa and Nod. And then we get a difference where Superman was having to stop a missile for some random reason in the theatrical version. We get that and it blows up and we get the release of our villains. I had a problem because part of me is going, okay, but as far as Krypton is, how is that little glass phantom zone thing in our solar system and so close to Earth? Mm-hmm. Donner Cut takes care of that. Mm-hmm. It shows that while they're floating out in space from Krypton, Krypton explodes, and the blast from Krypton launches them in the direction of Earth. We even see them pass Kal-El's ship as they're going, so that at least explained that. Mm-hmm. It also connected to the first movie. We get to see the moment where Superman's having to stop the missiles in the first movie. Mm-hmm. And we see him launch it into space, and then we find out that is what released Zod and Ursa and Non. So I do already, off the bat, I'm going, oh, thank you, Richard Donner, for explaining how this all works. So already great. I could have done without Zod yelling, "Free!" when he's released.
Well, I think this was on the podcast I was listening to, but they were saying, and how accurate it is, I won't, can't say this is canon, but from what I think we talked about a little bit on my episode about it was meant to be a cliffhanger, or at least in Donner's original idea, it was to be a cliffhanger. And actually the scene that we talked a lot about in your first episode of Superman turning back time was not supposed to be in the first movie. Mm-hmm. That was actually going to be the climax or the ending of the second movie.
We will talk all about the ending.
Yeah, and the producers were like, "No, we can't. We can't have that big moment in the second movie. We've got to do it in the first movie so we can make sure it's a hit." And so that changed. Donner was like, we'll have to make some changes, but he planned to do that when they went back to filming, which he never got to do. So the way that I heard it explained was him screaming, "I'm free," or freedom or whatever, was supposed to be the end of Superman 1. Like that beginning section is really supposed to be how Donner envisioned the end of the first Superman. And then it was supposed to be he shall free, and then it was cut to credits. Superman 2 comes next year to be continued, kind of a thing. And then that's why the credits then roll. The credits then roll at that point for the Donner Cut, which I thought was interesting. This one has kind of like a cold open, as you would say, unlike the first one. So,
yeah, well, no, the first one had the cold open because remember the first one opened with the comic book.
Oh, true. That is true.
Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, so right off the bat, we get Donner showing his connection from the first movie into the second movie, and we are set up. Okay, this is going to be a different view of this movie. And like I said, we do get the return of Marlon Brando. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about in the 80's Flick Flashback podcast about Brando suing. Eventually, Warner Brothers made a deal with Brando's estate several years later so that when Superman Returns came out, they could use Brando's likeness. And part of that deal also allowed them to go back and reuse him in this Donner Cut. Mm-hmm. The thing about the replacement of actors, though, and we kind of hinted a little bit about this in the 80's Flick Flashback. So Gene Hackman was done. He didn't return. So anything they wanted to use with Gene Hackman either had to already exist.
Right.
Or they had to find a body double of some sort that they could shoot over the shoulder or from a distance. And then they had to find someone who could sound like Gene Hackman and do some ADR work.
Right.
Did you find it as obvious of some of the ADR work?
None of the other ones stand out to me that like really took me out of it. I think some of the visual stuff was I caught more than the ADR stuff, I think. So.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the obvious visual differences too, especially in one scene. Just talking about another overarching aspect of the Donner cut is you could definitely tell Richard Donner did not want it to be as much of a comedy as Lester made it.
Right.
There was definitely less comedy. I'm not going to say no comedy. There was clearly comedy. There was one that went a little too far, though. Let me see if you can guess. What was in the Donner cut that was a clear, horrible joke that was not in the Lester cut? Can you think of that? Lester had a lot of silly things, but there's one moment that I think sticks out as just, what in the world, that was meant to be a joke that just sticks out like a sore thumb?
I can't think of it.
The toilet
You're gonna
flushing
say it
in the Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah. That scene bothered me.
Yeah. So Miss Tessmacher and Lex end up in the Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah.
And she immediately says, I wonder if he has a bathroom.
He has a bathroom, yeah.
Which is also said in the Lester cut, but it's just kind of a throwaway. That's kind of funny, you know. Oh, yeah, you never think about that. Does he have a bathroom in there? Then they have the whole moment where Lex is seeing these images of Jor-El, and then when it's all over, you hear a toilet flush, and you hear Miss Tessmacher yell, "Found it!"
Right, yeah.
And that, to me, that was too over the top. That was too silly. Did not need to be there.
No.
But Superman Clark is more emotionally engaged in the Donner cut. I'll get into this a little bit more, but the scene between he and Jor-El before he decides to give up his power is just amazing. Yes. But again, going back to the Lester cut versus the Donner cut, Donner almost goes a little too serious, and it again makes it these two different movies. I will say I didn't mind, and we talk a little bit about this on your show too, I didn't mind them removing all of the pratfalls when the villains are blowing the hurricane winds at them. I do like that Donner's feel of that really made it more like the citizens of Metropolis are in danger. Yeah. Which makes a little bit more sense as to why Superman chooses to leave.
Yeah, I agree with that. I noticed that watching the Donner cut, him leaving did seem more logical in the Donner cut. Yeah. And it wasn't so, I think maybe in the Lester cut, it was like, you know, they made that comment, he's leaving, he's a coward. In the Lester cut, it kind of felt that way, like he just leaves. But in the Donner cut, it was much more pronounced that he realized, I can keep fighting and I'll probably win, but people are going to get hurt in the process. And it's not worth, I'm willing to walk away from this battle to save Metropolis than to keep fighting and cause more damage than needs to be done. So that was better explained or better communicated in the Donner cut for sure.
Which was the whole point. I mean, that's what
Zod
said.
Oh, he's like, I know his weakness. Humans. He cares more for them than his own safety. Yeah.
All right, moving into a scene. I'm going to ask you about this. So in Niagara Falls, we get the scene where Lois is getting ready and Clark walks in his tuxedo. What did you think of that scene? How did that scene feel to you compared to the rest of the movie?
It did feel out of place, and it didn't feel as well. How can I put it? Script-wise, it didn't feel like it was fully thought out. Like it seemed like it was more of a work in progress than an actual fully fleshed out scene. to me.
What did you think of the way Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve looked in that?
They look different for sure. Even Margot Kidder looked younger than she does in the rest of the movie. So, but you're fresh faced out of the shower, but I don't know.
So here's the thing. When that scene starts, the first thing that I think people might notice, depending on how much they're paying attention, is that's not the same room they were put in when they first arrived at Niagara Falls. Clearly not the same room.
Right. And I was thinking, was this an extra room that the guy didn't show him when they checked in?
Yeah. I mean, it's not even the same color scheme. It's a different room.
Right.
Then when you watch Christopher Reeve, when you watch Clark, when Clark enters the room, he's got this full head of hair. Like poofy, fluffy, full head of hair. Then when they go to close-ups of him, his hair's slicked.
Slick, yeah.
And so, and it just changes between whether it's a close-up of Clark or it's the two-shot with Clark and Lois in the same shot. This one may not pick up to a lot of people, but Christopher Reeve is skinnier in this scene.
Yeah, I did notice that.
He doesn't have the I know he wasn't muscular, but he still had a build to him as he's playing Superman. Lois, her hair is lighter. I know you did some research for your 80's Flick Flashback. Do you actually know why all of this is the way it is?
Part of it is test screenings.
It was a screen test.
Yeah.
It was...
Oh, yeah, screen test for me. Yeah.
It was a scene that Richard Donner shot when he was trying to cast Lois Lane. And Christopher Reeve performed this scene with Margot Kidder. He performed this scene with Leslie Ann Warren. He performed this scene with Annie Archer, all these different actresses who were up for the role of Lois. He intended it to be in the movie, but he never got to film it for the movie.
Right.
And so this was literally a test screen of Margot Kidder, which is why Christopher Reeve eventually walks off and it's just Lois kind of almost just talking straight out because they're just wanting to focus on Margot Kidder. And then the same thing happened with Christopher Reeve. They're doing these shots of Christopher Reeve in close-ups, and my guess is almost they were doing kind of how is his hair going to look, because that slick hair is not even what he looks like in the rest of the movie.
Yeah,
and they were just having him do the same scene. Yeah,
testing looks, testing different ideas. I'm sure. Yeah,
but now let's get into one logistic thing about that. So Lois pulls out the gun and she shoots, and Clark just stands there and then, hands, stands up straighter, reveals he's Superman. And then Lois reveals it was a blank. She was shooting blanks. Did Superman not realize he didn't feel a bullet bounce off of him?
Yeah.
I mean, in the first movie, he catches a bullet.
And what's funny is when that scene, watching that scene today, when his mouth is closed before he says anything, and I was expecting to see the bullet between his teeth, like he caught the bullet with his mouth before she reveals it was a blank. So when she was like, "Oh, you mean," he's like, "Now, Lois, if you would have done that, if that would have worked, you would have killed Clark Kent." She's like, "With blanks," and I was like, it totally took me out, because I'm like you, like he would have felt it. You would have heard the bullet hit the ground as it bounced off of you. He would have known that was a blank. He would have known nothing came out of that gun.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
that's another reason why I felt like it wasn't as fleshed out or as well thought out of a scene as it could have been. I thought that scene could have been a lot better, which I'm sure it would have been if he would have been
actually
able to film it the way.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Yeah, that's my whole thing. I mean, the gun's not. I'm pretty sure, I don't know about guns a lot, but I'm pretty sure guns aren't made of lead. So I'm pretty sure he could have x-rayed visioned the gun and seen what kind of bullets were in it. I still also don't understand why when she shoots, he doesn't like flint, or still tries to keep the Clark persona, like maybe just flinch, move, and act like the bullet missed him or something. It was a very awkward scene. So when it comes to the reveal, when Clark reveals to Lois that Superman, I like the active part that Lois takes in the Donner cut, but the Lester version just kind of makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm with you. Like, I liked Lois's character in that scene. like you said, it's more, to me, it's more true to who Lois is. It's like, doggone it, I'm going to prove this is right. If, I'm going to keep trying to prove this is right.
Yeah.
In which, an interesting take on the Lester cut when he trips over, as Clarky trips over the bear rug and his hand goes in the fire. And there's the thought that, and I think doesn't she say, like, you wanted me to find out, or you didn't really want to keep it a secret. You wanted me to find out. Was that a line that she said in that?
I honestly can't remember that.
Yeah, I can't remember. Yeah. But there's something that's alluded to, and there was a thought that Clark really did. He's pretending to be Clark, but he's really Superman. So Superman would have known the bearskin rug was there, and he wouldn't have tripped over it. But he did trip to fall into the fire to be found out, because he knew that she was relentless and she was going to keep testing that, and eventually she was going to find out. So why keep up the charade and just go ahead and make the reveal now? So once again, that's could be more like fan theory than truth, but
really
I thought it was interesting.
Theory. That's a really good way to think of it. But we didn't even mention the very beginning when she sees Clark. She's looking at a picture of Superman, and hey, why haven't I never noticed this? And she draws Clark costume over top of Superman, which she does a great job with. And then she jumps out the window. Which, first off, I'm going, like, I wasn't born in the 70s. I don't know what, but the fact that a 8-story up building, however many floors she was up, has a window that you can open. That, I mean, there was like no window there. Like, you could just full out open that window.
Well, that there was no fire escape. There was nothing. Like, she jumped out. She would have hit something that would have been there to catch her. Yeah. Not just.
But I love, Clark runs down. He uses his breath to slow her down. Then uses his heat vision to open up the awning. Then uses her breath again. And then I love, once he realizes that she's safe, you see him just stroll back inside. Like, if you just catch it as she's about to hit the awning, you see him just walk right back inside. Yeah.
But then he's all the way back upstairs when she looks up and sees him looking out the window. So
well, somebody is up there. It clearly was not Christopher Reeve. All right, let's.
I just wanted to know if all the papers flew out of the people's hands when he rushed back up there. That's what I wanted to see.
All right, let's talk about another very pivotal scene, and that was when Superman chooses to give up his powers. So in the theatrical version, we don't have Brando, we don't have Jor-El, we have Laura. And when they have their conversation, Laura's reasoning is very vague to me. As to why he's got to give up his powers. And there's not a lot of pushback from Clark. So he says, I love her, agrees to do it. He steps into the crystal thing. And then my next part was the effects that then happen. So you see all this light happening. You get this freeze shot of his face, and then you see the skeleton, and you see the muscles and all that. And I was fine with that until the end of the movie, when it's flipped onto Zod, Nan, and Ursa, and I'm going, if this was so painful for Clark that it was going through all of this, how are they not feeling anything? I did like, though, even though it is kind of cheesy, I did like the visualization of then seeing him step out, but having Superman stay inside the crystal and then kind of fade away, because it showed this is what he's leaving behind.
A separation.
Of course, then when he, 10 minutes later, realizes he needs his powers back, it seems like he just walks in, finds the green crystal, and voila, he has his powers back. Right. The Donner cut, again, makes some of this work better, but it also makes some of it not make sense. And it starts off with that. Because the theatrical version, Clark talks to Laura, he chooses to give up his powers, and then he sleeps with Lois. In the Donner cut, they sleep together, and then the next morning, he's talking to Jor-El. And they're having what really felt like a father-son argument. And I honestly did. I liked that Superman really came across as selfish in that moment. And Jor-El calls him out on that. And And the fact that he says, haven't I done enough?
Mm-hmm.
And you're going, you've only been Superman for like 2 years at this point.
Right.
What do you mean, have you done enough?
Yeah.
But I like that because it's like even though he's, supposed to be 20s, maybe early 30s in the time frame, it sounds like, that teenager who's wanting to go off with
his own thing,
his new girlfriend and all that, and having the talk with the dad. It completely allows Christopher Reeve to just shine, especially with that duality. Yeah. Which we've talked about, I know, in multiple episodes whenever I bring up Christopher Reeve and Superman.
Right.
Christopher Reeve was so good at making Clark and Superman two different people.
Right.
And in this scene, he finds a way to merge them together.
Mm-hmm. And
it's just brilliant. And so the Donner cut does that so much better. It also explains where the clothes came from. Because, in the theatrical version, he goes in a Superman costume and he comes out wearing a shirt and pants.
Right.
In the Donner cut, he's already wearing the shirt and pants. In fact, Lois is wearing the Superman shirt, which is a great, I love that visual too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know how many people catch this. If you want to see the Donner cut, this is, to me, the best moment of the Donner cut. As Superman is losing his power, and Lois is looking from that ledge, you see Jor-El, and Jor-El just gives a side glance to Lois.
Yeah.
Like, look at what you have done.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely love that. Also, although it does bring up all these questions about how sentient is this computer.
Right.
But I absolutely love that.
Yeah, I agree.
Then when it comes back to him needing to get his powers.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my goodness.
Great scene.
And, and Jor-El's making it clear that, it's a sacrifice. You have to give up something, and what you're having to give up is your connection with me, with your connection with Krypton.
Yeah, man, that was a powerful scene.
It's not, and look, Smallville. One of my favorite moments of Smallville is in the final episode where Clark is given the Superman suit.
Mm-hmm.
He had already received the suit, but it had been locked away. Jor-El had sealed it up until he was ready for it, and he's finally ready for it. And a holographic, whatever you want to call it, version of Jonathan gives him the suit and tells him he's ready and how proud he is and all that. And that was a great moment. And what you realize is Donner did that moment here.
Mm-hmm.
Because when the Jor-El hologram computer is being deleted, Jor-El comes to life.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, it really seems like Christopher Reeve and Marlon Brando were not in the scene together.
Yeah.
Because they never show their faces at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But just for the moment, it's just such a great moment because you see Jor-El come in, you see him reach for Clark's shoulder, and when he touches the shoulder, you then get the close-up of Clark just kind of shivering, shaking. Which you realize he's getting his powers back, but you also just think it's that emotion.
Yeah, exactly.
He's finally gotten to touch his father and see his father.
Yeah.
Great moment. Absolutely great moment. Honestly, if Lester had kept that sequence, no, he didn't have the Brando rights, but if he had the Brando rights and kept that sequence, I think that alone would have elevated the Lester theatrical cut so much more.
Definitely.
All right, so on the 80's Flick Flashback, we talked about favorite scenes, and what was one of your favorite scenes in the movie?
I had a few, but let's talk about the White House.
The attack on the White House, because you grew up with a military background.
Yes.
So the attack on the White House with all of the soldiers defending the White House. By the way, I love the fact they're defending the White House, but they have no problem launching a bazooka inside the White House. Yeah.
Yeah, I did notice that all of the fighting happens inside the White House. There's no exterior shots of the White House at all.
No. Everything happens inside the White House.
Yeah.
All right. So those scenes are pretty much identical, except for two key parts that I happen to notice. And one of them I absolutely love. When Jor-El is standing there watching, because again, like we talked about, he doesn't get involved unless he has to.
Mm-hmm.
He's standing there watching Ursa and Nod take everybody out. And then the soldier comes through the window and it's right there at him. So he has to react.
Mm-hmm.
So he grabs the gun, pulls the guy in, and we don't see this in theatrical version, but then he goes, I'm going to use this.
Yes.
And starts
then he
firing the
shooting
machine
it.
gun. And the grin he has on his face,
Mm-hmm.
it's so evil. It's
Yeah.
so psychotic, and I love it.
You were talking about General Zod. You said Jor-El at the beginning.
Oh,
so.
I'm sorry. We were talking
That's
so
all right.
much about Jor-El
Yeah,
earlier.
no, it's like,
So yeah.
took me a second.
So Zod, so yeah, General Zod. But yeah, absolutely love it. You know, just that little grin on his face. And then they do something very similar a little bit later in the scene with Ursa. You have the guy who falls down in front of her, you know, kind of begging, pleading, you know, lowers his head, bows, you know, at her feet. And then she waits for him to look up and she winks and then kicks him. Another great little, just a few seconds, seconds. And what's crazy is even with these few seconds added, even with the longer scene that we just talked about with Jor-El and Clark, the Donner cut's 11 minutes shorter than the Lester cut, than the theatrical cut.
Well, you lose the whole Paris scene, which is a good, 5 to almost 10-minute scene at the beginning. Whereas he had to create a full scene to explain how they get out of the Phantom Zone. Yeah. Whereas in Donner's version, it was just an extension of the rocket scene.
All right, so one of my scenes that we talked about in the 80's Flick Flashback was the battle inside the fortress.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about all the crazy powers that get used. I mean, the S turning into some sort of cellophane blanket.
Right.
The duplicating themselves, the teleporting, all this crazy stuff that they do. Donner removed all of that. Mm-hmm. They get to the fortress and it immediately goes into Superman kind of manipulating them into the trap and using Lex to help that. I will point this out. Donner did still have a random power that Superman does that doesn't seem to fit Superman.
Okay.
When he and Lois were having their date in the fortress,
yes,
Superman looks at the champagne bottle and pops the cork.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah, he just looks at the champagne bottle and the cork pops out. Random. But it doesn't stick out like throwing the S.
Yes, we know this bothers you.
It bothers me so much. It makes just grabs it, throws it, becomes bigger, it wraps around Non. You would think, okay, it's like a netting. But as soon as he lands, it just fades away.
Right.
It's like, okay, what did you just do? That did nothing but buy you 10 seconds.
I want to find the behind the scenes footage or the documentary that eventually comes out of how that scene was constructed. Like, whose idea was it and what was the purpose?
I do not want to see that documentary. It just made me more mad. It was clearly Lester because Donner took it out. So
yeah. Well, you know, I think he was trying to he was, number one, beefing up that scene. And then two, he had to create more scenes to be the credited director. So yeah. At that point, it wasn't about making sense. It was just, we need 5 more minutes. Give me 5 more minutes of battle. Yeah. So.
Okay. Yeah, let's get away from that.
All right, moving on.
That S is horrible. All right, before we get into the ending, because that is the next big change, is the ending. Are there any other moments you can think of in the Donner cut that stick out?
No, because, let's talk about the ending. The ending is
everything that happens in the ending.
Yeah.
So we get the ending. We've got the supposed deaths of Zod, Ursa, and Non. I don't quite understand where they're falling to.
Right.
But we just have to assume they die. All right. Then things start to get different. So we now see Superman and Lois fly out of the fortress, land on some iceberg a little bit farther away, and then Superman uses his laser vision to destroy the Fortress of Solitude.
Right, which I didn't understand.
Well, I did, because the whole reason of the Fortress of Solitude, that was his connection to Krypton. That was where he was learning things. And the fact that he had to sacrifice that connection to get his powers back, there was really no point in the fortress anymore.
Yeah, I can see that.
Here's my bigger question. Did he get Lex out?
Yeah, because Lex just kind of disappears.
Lex was there. They were talking to Lex.
Yeah.
right before, because Lex was even saying, "Hey, I got an idea. I got a plan,"
Mm-hmm.
and they just leave Lex, and then he blows it up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what happened to Lex? Now, then we get to Superman returning Lois to her high-rise 2-story penthouse that somehow she affords on a reporter's salary. Little discrepancies in the return. There's a little bit more in the Donner cut of them talking to each other before he flies off. Then in the theatrical cut, we get the next day, and they're talking in her office, even though she's never had an office until now. And we get what I call the forget me kiss, or the amnesia kiss, which a lot of people have problems with because it's yet another power that they don't think Superman has. That's not necessarily true. We talked about this in the 80's Flick Flashback. I knew it did exist in the comics. I looked it up. He actually uses a similar ability in Action Comics number 306 back in 1963. So this was 10 plus years before the movie. And it's for the exact same reasons. Clark uses the kiss to leave Lois dazed and confused so that she forgets everything about knowing that Superman and Clark are the same person and keeping his secret identity. So it does have a comic background. Here's what I do like about it. I like that it helps to show that Superman, not only has he sacrificed the fortress, which again, we're talking theatrical cut. You don't see that.
Right.
But then it also shows that he is sacrificing Lois and he's choosing to be alone. And that works so well for the character. It creates a great character arc, a great character build that leads into further mythos of Superman. The Donner cut, Donner decided, you know what? We're going to act like the first movie didn't exist. And we're just going to reverse time again.
Yep.
And so even though he did it for the first movie, because as we talked about in the 80's Flick Flashback, he was kind of forced to, he decided, you know what? This is how I wanted to end the second movie. So that's how I'm going to end the second movie. So after Superman leaves Lois at the penthouse, we do see a pretty cool effect of the clouds. And then we get some random with Perry White brushing his teeth.
The toothpaste going back into the tube.
We start seeing
Lois's typewriter going backwards.
Yeah. We start seeing everything get reversed. We see the Washington Monument get restored, which replaced the Mount Rushmore bit that we talked about in your episode. We see the Coca-Cola sign get fixed.
Come back, yeah.
And we, of course, see Zod, Non, and Ursa get put back into the Phantom Zone and then fly off. And we even get this like funny grin from Superman when he sees that happen. Then he stops everything. We are now back, I guess, at the beginning of the movie before all of that happened. Although it makes me question, did the missile happen from the first movie? Because that's how they got free, but you just reversed that, and yet
you didn't do anything with the missile.
Did you stop that missile still?
Right.
I had questions.
I had a lot really
because this means none of the movie happened.
Exactly. And the end of the first movie didn't happen.
Well, maybe. We really don't know.
Yeah.
He could have went back and got the missile and just made sure the missile went another direction.
It's the Captain America going to put all the stones back in their place. Yeah. We assume it happened, but we don't know if it really did happen. Yeah. All right, so maybe you're going to talk about this, but this is the one thing I did not like that ruined the Donner cut form. Not ruined it, but took it down some notches. So if he turns back time...
Go ahead.
Then
I know you want to talk about that diner scene.
Then why does he go back to the diner just like in the Lester cut? Which we know Donner filmed those scenes, and I read something about that. People thought that Donner did not direct that scene because it was more outlandish, more like Lester comical. But he has a cameo in that scene that he says clearly shows that he was there for that scene. But anyway, if he turned back time, they never went to the diner when he was human Clark Kent only, so that guy wouldn't have known him. But the line is still there. We just got this place cleaned up from the last time. I didn't understand why that scene... I could have done without that scene at all in the Donner cut. It wasn't necessary.
So here's my belief, and it plays off of what you just said. So I totally agree with you. That scene now doesn't make any sense because it means Clark was never beat up. Again, I talk about in the 80's Flick Flashback.
Yeah. it goes
podcast
against
how that was very un-Superman-like.
Superman.
Makes
Exactly.
it even more un-Superman-like.
Yeah.
Because now he's just beating up some random dude who doesn't even know who he is.
Doesn't know why he's getting beat up. Yeah.
Yeah. Even though he acts like he does.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, like you said, there is the line where the guy says, I just got this place fixed.
Mm-hmm.
No, you didn't, because time reversed. It never got destroyed in the first place.
Right. Maybe he only reversed time in certain areas of the world and not...
Yeah.
No, just kidding.
But here's what I believe it was. I believe it does play off of what you said, where people believe that it was a Lester scene. And they believe that it was a Lester scene, not necessarily because it was so silly, but because in an interview, Lester actually said that scene was so important to him. And so Lester actually made it sound like it was his scene, that he came up with it. And that really ticked off Richard Donner.
Gotcha.
And Richard Donner said in his own interview, when he was talking about that, he pretty much said he heard that in the interview and then just said, oh, you SOB. He said, you know good and darn well that was my scene. He goes, I'm even in it.
Right, yeah.
You know, I'm in that scene.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think it kind of was, I think it was Donner keeping it in the movie as a slap in the face to Lester.
To Lester. Okay, yeah. I can see that.
Yeah, no, it makes no sense. It should not be there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's why it's there.
Petty directors.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's what you get from a couple of dicks. All right, so ultimately, in my opinion, the Lester cut, the theatrical cut, works better for the overall mythos, the overall story of Superman moving forward, especially the fact that DC was still trying to keep it connected to the comics. Donner's cut not only seems to forget that there was a first movie, but the fact that he again turns back time and does what he does, even that final scene going back and beating up this random dude for no reason, it makes Superman look like a god.
Yeah.
Like he just does whatever he wants to do.
Right, right.
And doesn't care how it's going to affect the other lives, which contradicts what had been said in the movie.
Right, because him turning back time doesn't just turn back the time of people he knows, but everybody on the planet. So what have you erased from their lives that didn't have anything to do with your challenges or the things that were affecting your life? So, yeah.
You know, and clearly we can get into a whole time travel bit of
he
goes back, and now because this didn't happen, does that mean that this happens instead? And how does it affect other people's lives? You know,
right.
You know, butterfly effect type thing. So yeah, that was my thing. Now, had Donner been able to finish the original movie, he made it known, as you said in the 80's Flick Flashback, that the time reversal, and I said earlier, was meant to be the ending of Superman 2. He hadn't quite thought of an ending for Superman 1. You mentioned that it was just going to be the cliffhanger of releasing Zod and Non and Ursa. And part of me is curious, like, would that have been the ending? Or would the Salkins had said, hey, look, you can do that, but we still got to have a big, epic Superman saves the day ending. And part of me wonders, what would it have been? Like, I'm very curious to have seen the full plan that Donner had.
Yeah.
That's really what, which is already getting into it. Let's finish this up. Final decisions. Bag it, stack it, or trade it. I will, of course, let you go first, and you can talk about both versions.
Okay.
We don't really rate stuff on the 80's Flick Flashback, so
no.
Clearly you can talk about both versions. You can say which one you like better, however you want to do it. You can treat them separately, treat them as one thing, whatever you want to do. Go ahead, Tim.
This is a tricky one.
You ain't
Unlike
kidding.
the Justice League, like the Justice League we talked about, there's a clear, better film. For this one, there's things I love in both, and there's things that I don't like in both. So if I could combine the two of the things that I like, then I'm bagging it. If I have to take them individually, oh man, I would probably just bag both of them. Yeah. I mean, they're still
both good movies.
They're still both good movies. I mean, like I said, I enjoy Superman 2. The theatrical version that I saw on cable or whatever, I still have a great fondness for. Now seeing the Donner cut, there's things that I like that I wish would have been in it. That would have made it even better. But like you said before, just kind of saying which is better, Superman 1 or Superman 2. They both are equally as good and both have flaws that you wish could make the way they would be better. But yeah, I'm gonna bag them.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I will actually bag both of them because you were kind of alluding to this in what you were saying. There is no true version of this film.
Yeah.
We're talking about the theatrical cut and the Donner cut. But we've talked about this in both your episode and my episode. There were TV edits that are different versions of the movie that kind of mixed together some of Lester and what eventually became Donner, the Donner cut. There's actually a fan-made version that's like a bootleg version that's out there. It's called like the International Ultimate Edition.
Okay. I got you.
Of where someone took the best of what they thought from each one. I mean, it's not a clean cut because this was before the Donner cut existed.
Right.
But they kind of put together some of the best from the TV edits and from the theatrical version and put together.
Yeah.
And the thing is that, like you said, both versions are the same story.
Yeah.
It's the same story told two different ways. Whereas Justice League and the Snyder Cut, they, are the same story, but they are completely changed in how the story unfolds.
Exactly.
And it makes it two different movies. It's the same movie, just with different. It's almost like you're watching, sticking with DC. It's almost like you're watching a multiverse, this is the Earth, 2 version, and this is the Earth, 87 version of what's happening. Like you said, they both have good and bad. The theatrical version is better for entertainment purposes. The Salkins did what they wanted. They made it a successful blockbuster movie. And you talk about a lot of that in the 80's Flick Flashback podcast. It made for a good Saturday afternoon movie that was good for kids and families. The Donner cut is a little deeper. It's a little, I'm not going to say darker.
No.
But it's more serious.
Yeah.
It tells more of a straightforward story. And again, it has the great elements like we talked about with Jor-El and with Lois, which helps in those cases, helps to build the mythos. So like you're saying, it's hard to separate these two because there are elements of Lester's version that just work so well for the movie, for the character, for the legend that is Superman.
Right.
And then the Donner cut, same thing. It's just so much is there that works, doesn't, toilet flushing. And so it's hard to tell them apart. It's hard to really say which one's better. I mean, ultimately, I hate to say this. Ultimately, I do think that the theatrical version is better. Again, if I could take elements out of the Donner cut and put them into the Lester cut,
right,
I would prefer that movie. But as an overall movie, the Lester version works better, in my opinion. But I still say bag it for both of them. Absolutely.
I agree. We're both saying the same thing, and I'm like you. It's like if I just want to watch Superman 2, I'll probably watch the theatrical version. That would be my first choice. But that's because of the nostalgic factor. But then I'll probably want to go and just watch certain scenes of the Donner cut right afterward to get those moments as well. So
yeah, because that's the thing. The Donner cut feels more like a special feature.
Yeah.
The Donner cut is almost like you're saying. If you could just take the good moments out of the Donner cut, just add them in as deleted scenes, quote unquote, on a Blu-ray of the theatrical, I'd be satisfied with it.
Yeah. Because it enhances the experience it enhances the film that you already love. It's not taking anything away from it.
And I totally agree with you. I would watch the theatrical version if I was just saying, oh, I'm going to watch Superman 2. I would watch because if I watched the Donner cut, yes, I would enjoy it and I would enjoy moments. But I still, when they get to the battle in the fortress, I would be thinking about him throwing the S. I would be thinking about him duplicating himself.
Mm-hmm.
I would be thinking about these moments. And I honestly think the only thing when I'm watching the theatrical version that I think about is the absence of Marlon Brando.
Yeah.
Nothing against the actress that plays Laura.
Mm-hmm.
Although we didn't talk about this on either episode. I'm going to throw this back in. The random dude that pops up first that reads the poem in the theatrical cut. There's just this bald dude when he puts in the first crystal.
Oh, yeah.
Bald dude.
Oh, yeah. The
Don't know.
trees. Yeah.
Never met a poem as lovely as a tree.
Right.
Yeah. Which Marlon Brando does in the Donner cut. I was like, why couldn't that have been Laura? I didn't get it. But that's it. All right. Any last thoughts you might have, Tim? I think we've made this clear. We've done 2 full episodes.
It's like, this has been pretty exhaustive, I think.
It's pretty exhaustive. Go back and listen to 80's Flick Flashback to get the beginning of this story. And then we just finished it up with the continuation with the Donner cut here. So, yeah, I think we've covered it all.
It's exhaustive because I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
No,
it's
a great movie. Definitely worth. I mean, if you've listened this far, you've watched it before. But if you haven't watched it in a while, go back and watch both versions and believe that a man can fly again.
Again, our episodes may be 2 weeks apart, but we recorded these episodes back to back.
Yeah.
So we definitely have had our thoughts. We probably even confused what episode we were recording at some point. Yeah. So you definitely have to go back and listen to the 80's Flick Flashback and listen to this one so you get the full experience.
Yeah. We do this for you, the listeners, because we love you. Thank you for listening.
Absolutely. And just return the favor with a little review for both the 80's Flick Flashback and for Moving Panels on Apple Podcasts. Help us get that show out there.
Exactly.
In both of our cases. And again, thank you, Tim. And it's been a fun collaboration with you on this, and I'm sure we'll do it again. Hey, we still got Superman 3 and Superman 4.
Oof, yes. You hear the excitement in my voice?
Oh, yeah. Well, those will be fun.
Richard Pryor and some Russian dude. Let's go.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for Moving Panels. I'm Laramy Wells. I'll see you on the other side of the page.
All right, I gotta go to bed. Hello, movie viewers and fellow movie lovers. My name is Tim Williams, and I'm the creator and host of Movie Views Presents the 80's Flick Flashback podcast. See, I love the 80s, and I have a great appreciation and nostalgic passion for the classic 80s flicks that birthed my love for movies and ultimately helped shape my childhood. On each episode, I'll discuss, with a special guest co-host of course, a different film from the 1980s. We'll share memories, favorite characters, iconic scenes, and even share some behind-the-scenes stories along the way. We'll discuss famous blockbusters like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Coming to America, Ghostbusters, Dirty Dancing, Top Gun, Die Hard, and many, many more. As well as some other cult classics and even lesser-known flicks we discovered on cable TV or the now-defunct video rental stores. Remember those? No matter what 80s flick we choose to talk about, we'll always have a good time, so come and check us out. You can find the 80's Flick Flashback podcast on major podcasting platforms like Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and more. Be sure to subscribe or follow so you don't miss a single episode. Once again, I'm Tim Williams, and I hope you'll join me for the next 80's Flick Flashback.